So after the visioning, we are going to do some horizon scanning. One of the favorite EPSC exercises, namely to look at the horizon and to see what is coming up. And we'll do it in two parts. The first one will be about the infrastructure of democracy, expertise, evidence, think tanks. And the second will be about the relationships between societies and within societies. So we'll start with the infrastructure of democracy. And that is enormously crucial because democracy is not just about the process, it is also about substance. It is also about what it delivers. So we sit here in an institution which I think could well call itself a temple of evidence-based policy, because evidence is so much at the heart of what the European Commission does. And even though we face a lot of headwinds, I have to say that the temples of evidence-based policy have also adjusted and adapted. They have been reconstructed. Just think of the agenda of this commission and how it has changed, how important issues that have to do with security and defense are. It wasn't the case when this commission started 4 years ago. Just think of how much has changed with respect to transparency. A few years ago, people wanted to have a say on how trade agreements are negotiated. Well, now everything is on the website. All the positions in the Brexit negotiations, in the trade negotiations, are available for everyone to judge. So the temple has been changing, but of course we are chasing a moving goalpost. And to discuss that, I would like to invite four distinguished panelists, Antonella Mei-Pochtler, Head of Strategy Unit, Austria, Think Austria at the Federal Chancellery in Vienna. Warm welcome. Jakub Janda, who's directed the European Values think tank in Prague, and he also is the head of the Kremlin Watch program, which I think will tell us a lot about what Jakub does. Warm welcome. A long-standing friend of ESPAS and EPSC, Kristel van der Elst, Director General of Policy Horizons in Canada, that works. That is the Foresight department of the Canadian government, if I can simplify. And last but not least, another good friend of ESPAS and EPSC, Anthony Gooch, who is Director of Public Affairs and Communication at the OECD. Warm welcome. So this is going to be a conversation, so if you could please keep your remarks brief so that we could also engage everyone in the audience at some point. And I would like to start with Antonella and the question to you, because you run a think tank inside the federal government in Austria. It's also a strategy unit. And we've learned from our predecessors in the previous panel how to be straight talkers. So I will ask you a straightforward question. How happy you are with the expertise that you provide? And by you, I don't mean just you in the Austrian government, but how happy should we be about the expertise that we provide to our political masters?
So thank you very much. I'm not sure, I take the question, but I'm not sure that how happy I am is the relevant benchmark. I think the relevant benchmark is how effectively do I influence policy decisions. And I think, there are a couple of prerequisites to being able to influence positively policy decisions. And the prerequisites are not just, having the right evidence. Or let me put it this way. Good evidence is not a ticket to conviction. I think you need to change the mind of the decision maker. You need significantly more than just the evidence, and the evidence. It's a broad concept. evidence, you have the basic information, you have an understanding of the starting point, you have a lot of what-if scenarios, and in the end you have, however, to capture sort of the share of mind of the decision maker and make sure that he or she really, gets it, which I'm not saying it's a matter of understanding it, but it's a matter of getting up the priority list and making sure that there is an understanding of the interrelationships of the decisions. And I think that is a significantly more complex work than just delivering evidence. And just to reflect back, I mean, I'm in this position, which is basically next door to the Chancellor. So it's really, I mean, we have communication team on the one side and the evidence team on the other side of his office. The proximity with both, with the decision maker, but also with the communicators is essential. The dialogue with them, making sure to understand, what is on their mind and how can I capture my sort of, as I said, the share of mind. That is an important one. And I've started this just 9 months ago. I have a career in management consulting, so I come from an experience on how to influence top CEOs, and I think that is an essential prerequisite to be able to really deliver the evidence in the right way. So I think it's a long answer to your question. How happy am I? I think I'm testing as we go with an approach that I know from business and from management consulting, and so far so good. I think that we are I think that we have some influence, some impact. But I mean, ask me in a couple of years, and then we will see if then finally we get things done. Because for me, the only relevant question is, do we get things done? Not do we get listened, but do we get things done?
Sure, but maybe I will put this question somewhat differently. Namely, what surprised you when you joined the government after a distinguished career in the business sector? Because what I'm getting at, what I'm getting, you have 2 minutes. No, but what I'm getting at is the demand side of the equation. Namely, given everything that goes on in the world of politics, given all the fragmentation that we are witnessing, how much demand is there for expertise and evidence, and how is that demand changing?
I think the truth of the matter is that we have some long cycle and short cycle activities that we're working on in government, and that is, it's similar in a company. I think it's not a big difference. The issue, though, is that the level of media influence in whatever is done is enormous. I think that I was not. For me, this was surprising that there is so much of the political work. I would say I tend to say it's 20% content and 80% is communication, and that 80% is very, very strong, very overpowering, and there is a lot of thinking, coming from how do I deliver the message that influences what content in the end you can position. So I think that's a big difference, and given the changes in media and given the changes, broadly speaking, with the level of information and disinformation, that makes the management of this 80% highly complex. And I think that therefore, in terms of the type of evidence-based work, I think just the standard. I'm an economist from a background. The standard analysis that you do and the good fact checking and so on that you do is fine, but you need to have a very strong media sentiment analysis getting in, so that you understand, what are the biases that your politicians, and we are in a coalition government, and the coalition partners have, what are the biases that the population have, how do I manage those biases? I think that's as much a part of the job as just the real, I would say, the real substance or the real content. So I think that makes the job more definitely more difficult and more complex, and also adds a dimension that we usually don't have in the typical evidence or think tanks, traditional think tanks, and I think that's something that we need to capture too.
Yes, thank you so much. Jakub, in the opinion piece for us, which everyone has in their folders, you call for think tanks to become advocacy organizations. So you argue that times have changed and the onslaught is going on, and think tanks have to be much more active than they have been. Now, can you take us through the arguments why that should be the case?
Yeah, I'm actually not speaking about everybody should become an advocacy player. I'm working in the field of security policy. My personal and institutional goal is actually to persuade European policymakers to take seriously the threat of Russian government and Chinese government influence activities in Europe. This is what I'm trying to do. And in this very specific field, which is, you could imagine, politically quite sensitive, what I'm basically trying to say is that we have quite a lot of research, quite a lot of data which is already available on both issues, on Russian and Chinese influence activities. The problem we have in my field is that it's quite hard and sensitive for non-government organizations anywhere in Europe, with exceptions of the Baltic states or a couple of other countries, to actually stand up, sometimes publicly, sometimes non-publicly, and actually advocate for what they wish for. In the area of, for example, Chinese influence activities, it's even harder, since the Chinese government is very good in co-opting various voices in Europe. So it's actually not very easy for being a China expert, which I'm not, but many people are, which focus on China and want to really think about how can Europe defend its core values and institutions from influence of a totalitarian state, for example. And it's similar on Russia with some exceptions. So basically what I'm trying to say is that what we have seen over, since Crimea, since 2014, since Russia invaded Ukraine, is that there is not a lack of evidence or knowledge. Even most of European policymakers get their own intelligence reports. Most of European intelligence agencies gather the knowledge from the same sources, so similar sources. So it's not a lack of evidence, it's a lack of people who are actually willing to take those dozens and dozens of advocacy meetings with members of parliaments, with assistants to members of parliaments, and that's what I mean by speaking up publicly about what should be done. That's what we are trying to do. We are gathering more and more political enemies because of it as well. But that's what I think should be done in more, let's say, broader and specific basis. And I'm really speaking about my field, where it's very politically sensitive, you can imagine. It's not, I would say, a relatively politically calm as speaking about tech or economics. I know those fields are quite hard. But on national security and Russia-China, speaking about this publicly, we need more public voices which are not willing just to describe it, but to say things which should be done and advocate for them. Because the gap between what should be done, there is a good knowledge about it, but people pushing for it publicly, there is a big gap. So that's my knowledge.
So maybe I want to get a little bit deeper into that issue, why people refuse to accept evidence. And I would like to have your view on the subject, because the reasons could be manifold. People have a certain predetermined view of the world, and they don't want to change it. People have interests. So which of these you think is most significant in the current situation?
Well, if I exclude direct elite capture, so strategic corruption schemes, which are quite known anywhere in Europe, so if I exclude this, I think the core of our problem with European policy-making community anywhere, more or less, is that getting outside of the comfort zone and actually acknowledging that we actually are in a direct confrontation first with Russia and will be in one with China if China doesn't co-opt us in Europe, to use Europe as a tool against the US in the future. It is actually hard to understand that we are in this for a long run. This is not, maybe a couple of people thought after Crimea, after 2014, it will maybe take a couple of years, it will be just a regional issue somewhere in the east. That's what many people in Europe thought. Now we all can see that it's clearly not true. We see many of Russian influence activities in Europe actually going more aggressively. And to make just one point, the question I get a lot, why is the Russian government actually engaging inside Europe that much? Why doesn't it stop? And the answer is quite simple, because there is not enough of deterrence and punishment coming from Europe. Whatever Russia does today, more or less, inside Europe in a non-military fashion, influencing buying of individual politicians or elections, or hacking them, there is not enough punishment for it. And what I'm basically trying to say with the policymaking community is that it hurts to actually start or to respond to a confrontation at the state level. There are countries which are doing it, but there are many policymaking communities in Europe which are not willing to do so, because still we believe, and I believe last 3-4 years actually shown that it's a false idea or doesn't really work, that appeasement can work, that at the end we will find a way how to talk with the Russian government. Well, we will not, unfortunately, unless we respond with defending our own institutions here, which I'm afraid we are not doing there. And my final point would be, I think the European response to Russian influence operations, it's like maybe 30, maybe 40% of what we are doing now. In 100 would be what we could be doing. So I think we are really much lacking in responding. And it's just the comfort zone thing, mainly.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, Kristel, I want to ask you about how well Foresight is doing in governments. And of course, your own appointment is a testimony to the fact that Foresight is becoming more and more important. We also have a Foresight unit, by the way, in the new structure of the Secretariat General of the Commission. But do you think that our political masters make enough out of Foresight, out of what you are getting from what they're getting from people like yourself? So how is the impact of Foresight? Of course, we are all working on it, but what can we say about the impactfulness of Foresight in a world which is shifting on a daily basis?
What can we say about impact? I mean, for sure, I think in this conference, and you know what Mei-Pochtler said, the first conference was like, we need to start managing. I still remember your sentence, by instead of by crisis, by foresight, is something that has rippled down a lot more in the last years. Of course, we always cite the same countries, you know, Singapore, Finland, etc., as being kind of really great at it, and we celebrate it, and most countries don't do a lot of foresight because it just, you know, they deal with the current, there's nothing different about them, they just deal with the current urgencies rather than the long-term important issues. However, we do see a lot more of foresight being practiced, and there's a number of reasons for that. It's the way the world changes, I think. Politicians at some point can't anymore just suppose that it's not going to be on their watch, that there might be big disruptions that are coming up, because the world is changing a lot faster. And so we see a lot of novelty coming up, and so by consequence we don't know how things will play out. So someone needs to provide that advice to help thinking about what might actually happen. What does it mean? What does it mean for the policy officer? But having those interpretive skills and not just having right research is something that there's more and more demand for. What do we do now with like all this uncertainty? But I think what is very important also is that we start to have, and across political systems, across countries, across value sets, we see more and more kind of, you know, polarity, pluralism. And so the way we were making decisions and the way, you know, people were thinking and showing their leadership is not that evident anymore. You can't just go out of the idea that you're an expert on everything, you have the right answer, and you just take the right decision. So for me, I think politicians are more and more, it's a starting field, I think, in politics. Some countries have shown how to do it, where the usefulness is, have it in their DNA. Others know they have to do it, are creating the infrastructure for it, to say so. It is, first of all, a mindset change, right? And so I always say that's you know, patience and persistence, right? So you get only impact with time, actually. And then there's plenty of countries who kind of, you know, you can call it foresight or not, but they're extremely good in setting out their visions and going after them. And, you know, they don't have a foresight unit, but they have great planning units, right? So I think from looking forward and the foresight, a lot of countries have big benefits from it. Some of those we have been discussing today. I mean, China is fantastic in foresight, right? So they're just amazing, really doing well. get a lot of impact
Yeah.
from
Yes.
it. Yeah.
One of the issues that you draw attention to in your piece is credibility of expertise, and Antonella also draws attention to that, the integrity of data, for example. So how can we ensure that the credibility of expertise is strengthened in a world in which people claim to have, better information? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, one could say, almost. So how do we protect the integrity of expertise and data? I will actually want to get feedback from Antonella too later.
My opinion is like you might as well, I mean, to be a bit provocative maybe, but you might as well give up on trying to have the truth. Like all the advices that we give to the policymakers, etc. I mean, they might be based in research, but it's been shown that all the think tanks and all the advice that's been given is rooted in values, right? So given that we have more diversity of values, we will obviously have less agreement on kind of what is evidence. And certainly when you talk about the future, it's only assumptions, there's no data, right? So we can as well give up on this and think like, okay, there are multiple truths. There are multiple ways of looking exactly at the same thing, and the ambiguity, you showed it with your picture. You can look at one picture and have two stories behind it. It's more, I think we need to go to a mindset of not getting it right, trying to get the one truth, but we have to learn to live with these different data sets, interpretations, analysis, and take it as a richness. You always wonder, whose data is this? Whose future is this? What can I learn from it? How is this different from mine? Where are the hypotheses? And maybe, instead of fighting it, trying to see how can we kind of bridge some of those ideas. Because I feel like fighting for the one truth is still playing, as we said, in the old system of the old infrastructure, and it's really cool to hang on to because we've all been paid to be experts. But if we move to that through the transition moment and we move to the new world, I think we just have to get really good interpretive skills rather than really good knowledge and data.
But you seem to be taking us to a different future which doesn't exist yet.
I'm already behind the transition, right? So I'm a foresighter, right?
Because what we witness nowadays is a huge degree of polarization.
Yes.
And I don't think we have a sufficient degree of readiness in societies that we are talking about to come to terms with the fact that there are different interpretations of the facts, that there are different sensitivities. Yes. I think people at this stage, at least, in the Western world, seem to be putting themselves in the different camps. Yeah. So
why are we surprised by that, right?
So my question would be, how do we get from A to B then? How do we get to the type of the world that you are talking about?
Well, by letting go of trying to find the truth and just accepting that we live in a world that is, with multiple values, multiple perspectives, and we have all our own values. I mean, when you work for a certain government or you work for a certain organization, it's based on values, right? The European system is based on the number of values that you have. So you are also driven by values. The advice that you are giving to the governments and to policymakers are also driven by your values. I think it's fine to stick to your values, but you can't expect everyone to have the same values and thus provide the same advice and look at things at the same way. We just have to find a way to live together kind of in a society at a higher level, at the international level, that we can kind of compare and contrast and negotiate, but we don't need to have the same value. We don't have them anyway. But so there's not going to be truth, I think, that it's just what it is. That's,
Yes.
We just have to give up on that,
Thank you. Antonella, about this issue of integrity, of data, of statistics, I mean, what can we do to make people feel more confident about the data that they are provided?
I think there are two levels. I think how to make people feel more confident about the data, I think, that's a much more complex question, because as we know, there is this process of what is called reality apathy. The more you have information, the more you are in a information overflow, the more you start to distrust the information that you get, and it's a mechanism of reduction of complexity. I mean, it's just a survival, I would say, survival mechanism, human survival mechanism. So I think, avoiding, constant data overflow may help to increase the trust, but then, you need also to have the right data. And I think, one of the key things is the independence of statistical data, the independence of data sources, and that is not the case by and large. I will never understand why for companies you have some rating agencies. Like, I mean, you can discuss about the rating agent. One can say, I mean, they're American-based, whatever. But if you look at the Moody's and so on, there is the standard way of looking at companies, and that it's an established. So there is a standard setter, and we don't have the same thing in many policy driven in many policy areas. In a sense, when we look at some of the OECD data and so on, I think that there is something that goes in that direction, but it's not. There is not the pure sort of the standard set of data and of analysis that is approved and is independent of anything else. And there are no direct data. The data sources are in many countries not checked. And if I see the effort that a company like the previous consulting company I was working on, BCG, is doing in terms of source selection and source review, and just checking, making sure that there is a real quality. We know exactly, we don't take those sources but those others, and if we take the others, you need to add 10% and so on. There is a whole team just looking at data quality, data integrity, data, overall evidence, evidence security, if you want. And I don't see the same type of thoroughness in policy areas. And I think one of the reasons is that we have a dual function of evidence entities, let me put it, or think tanks and so on. One is sort of working in a policy supporting evidence. That is, I think, the majority. You have a policy, you want to push something, and you're looking around, give me the, it's like, what do we put the 2 points and then we make, I mean, this is something that you just try to, I'm not saying that you are making up the data, but there is a lot of room for interpretation. I think that nothing can lie as much as data if you put them in the wrong way, or if you interpret them in a certain way. So I think that there is a lot that is serving some set policies, and the minority is evidence-derived policies, and the evidence-derived policies are difficult. And I would like to come to the point that you made about Russia. I mean, you can imagine, we are in Austria. We deal a lot with Russia. We have a dialogue with Russia. We don't have necessarily. We are not blue-eyed in viewing Russia, in spite of what may seem to be a very benevolent view on Russia. But we have a lot of what-if scenarios that we keep in mind in terms of, okay, we know that there is something going on here, and also same thing in looking at China. But what are the various scenarios if we take a harder stance, medium stance, softer stance, and how do we play around? And what is in the multi-stakeholder context, how can we play with harder to softer stances in the whole, orchestra of politicians that we have, and that needs to be supported. So there is not, necessarily a lack of recognition that there is a big risk and that there is a big influence and that there is that one needs to be on high alert on this. But there is a recognition that, gee, it's quite a complex thing, and it's like, you need to play checks and balances, and you need to make sure that in the end you don't create more harm from that. So I think from one thing, having the right data, moving away from copy-paste policy briefings. I've never seen so many copy-paste policy briefings as in politics. I mean, this would be, I mean, every junior consultant at BCG would have gone out. So moving away from that, making sure that you have real quality data sources, but then once you have the evidence, making sure that you have the right orchestrated discussion. I think that's what may create more trust.
Right, thank you so much. There was a reason why we put you on the same couch, so thank you for that introduction. We will, by the way, take a couple of questions in a while, but I want to come to Anthony, because you told us in your contribution that we should speak more to the heart and soul of people. Now that's very refreshing coming from the OECD, because now you are the reputable organization that we all look to for hard data and hard evidence. And now you would want us to take this to the hearts, and isn't that, is that winnable? Is that doable?
I don't think we have any choice. So I think probably that we've come to a point where on a number of levels, cycles are probably coming to their natural end. Ways in which we've been doing things are coming to their natural end. And the moot point is whether we can evolve, transition, transform into something new. And we've had a lot of discussion about that in the course of today in a peaceful manner, or whether that's going to be done in a slightly different way. The word emotion has been used quite a lot in today. Franz Timmermans this morning spoke about language. Now, by my accent, you would say I am British English. So the word emotion in Britain, it has different connotations, but often, oh, don't get emotional. So that means someone who's becoming a little bit unpredictable. There's another side to me, which is Spanish, and if I were to use the word emoción in Spanish, it's very positive. So there's a strong connotation of happiness there. And I think that many institutions take the English Anglo-Saxon interpretation, and I would say certainly the OECD that I joined in 2008, just before Lehman Brothers collapsed, was in that space. Who do we work for? We work for human beings. Now, I heard a word that rather, it made me uncomfortable. The word populace was used about 6 or 7 times in the last panel, and it made me think of the Ancien Régime, you know, Marie Antoinette chucking brioche out of a chateau. We work for people, citizens. If I were to give you a definition of who the OECD works for, citizens who vote and pay tax. Why do I say that? Because in countries where you don't really have the ability to raise your own domestic resources, probably the levels that we operate at, good public pensions, health, education, the sort of the stuff that we're known for is maybe less relevant. If you work for human beings, then you have to be able to relate to human beings. So, what evidence are we collecting? Do we collect evidence on trade, open trade, free trade? Do we believe in open trade and free trade? A lot of people say, I believe in it. In evidence-based organizations, they use the word believe. Oh, that sounds to me a bit theological. Fast forward, let me see, 2008, the OECD produced a report called Growing Unequal. It was commissioned in 2006. We didn't wake up to that when the crisis hit. Unfortunately, what that evidence showed was that within our societies, within well-to-do societies of OECD member countries, essentially the gap between the rich and the poor and the rich and middle class had opened very significantly. That wasn't the deal when we recommended a lot of policies that we would equate with a classic definition of globalization, where you're talking about the free movement of goods and services and people to a certain extent. So in a situation like that, you confront something which is that an unintended consequence is the best you can present that as. But with that, and the combination of that plus the financial crisis, what you logically would have is a lot of people who say, I don't trust you anymore. So when you do produce evidence, and I take what you said regarding the fact that it's difficult to arrive at certain truths, although if we want to base ourselves on a system of international cooperation, rule of law, we'd all have to agree that there needs to be a corpus of elements, and they have been developed over the last 70 years, that people would consider to be internationally agreed values and laws that encapsulate them. We've got a real job on our hands to actually connect up with the people that we work for and actually find out what's most important to them. Now, example, GDP. So GDP was never supposed to be a measure of the success of a country. And yet, over time, people would say, well, you know, our level of GDP is now this, and isn't that fantastic, and your level is now that. And somewhere along the line, everybody seemed to buy into this thing. Everybody in circles like these ones, not today, obviously. So we were confronted with a situation, and that came home, I think, to roost in the context of the Brexit discourse in Britain, where in a gathering, someone shouted at someone who shouted or who gave a figure of, oh, you know, GDP growth for the United Kingdom probably connected to migratory flows. And then someone shouted, that's your GDP, not mine. Aggregates. We use aggregates. Human beings aren't aggregates. That attacks their political decency. Also, human beings live in households. We are human beings. Households, they take different shapes and forms. And yet, traditional measures that have been developed, statistics, they come from a word which is the state. Today, everyone's talking about data. Sexier, sounds more fun. And it's also citizen-centric. We generate and develop it ourselves. So if we have Facebook and Twitter and they're as powerful as they are, guess who's giving them that power? We are. So we have to think very carefully about that element. So when we talk about bringing heart and soul in, it's also to bring a type of intelligence that is not, I would say, as demanded as it should be within international organizations, whether it's the European Commission, European institutions, or others, and that's to have an emotional intelligence. To actually be able to put yourself in the shoes of people who may have quite different lives to the ones that you do. And this is not theoretical. And I think that this requires a lot of effort in terms of actually getting out and about, talking to people we don't normally talk to, engaging with people who disagree. And in the previous panel, someone said, well, it's fantastic. In fact, no, in your introduction, I think you said, we're very transparent now. And we've posted something on a website. Wow. Most people don't go on websites. You've got to get to them somehow. You've got to make that extra step to be able to connect. And so I think this is a challenge that we at the OECD see very clearly. It came home to roost when we, for the first time ever, probably we became engaged in a political discussion around Britain's future membership of the European Union. And we were confronted with a very difficult situation where very quickly all of the learned work that we put together in a 60-page document with lots of footnotes and lots of annexes, all it took was sections of the British media to say the EU funded OECD, boom, you know, and that was us slightly cut off at the knees. But the manner in which we went about things, I think, was an object lesson in how not to do something if you really want to make an influence. But I think in all of this, we're caught in a situation where things have changed a great deal in a very short period of time. We're trying to play catch-up, which is not an easy thing to do. But I think in terms of longevity, I don't think we have any choice. If we stay in some rational, idyllic setting, firstly, we're going to miss most things. And secondly, I don't think we're going to have any social license to operate.
Thanks so much, Anthony. So it's a call to arms with respect to engaging with people. Would there be questions at this stage? Yes, Heather, here, please. Yeah.
One of the most striking features about populism, or whatever you want to call it, is that it gives scant regard to research, data, and particularly to deliberation. So how do you stand up for experts and expertise in an era of sound bites and hashtags? This sounds like a simple question, but I'd like to refer it to what you said earlier about the fact that memes and framing are things that spread much faster through social media than data. And of course, incorrect facts, fake facts actually get spread much quicker. So is this a matter of regulation? Is this a matter of self-regulation by the tech companies, or is this something that essentially everybody in society simply has to work on together?
Well, brilliant question. And anybody else, please? Yes.
Hello, yes, Jose Manuel Roche, Save the Children and University of Oxford. I was fascinated by the point about values being, policy being rooted as much in evidence as in values. And then the multiple values that actually can, how interpretations and analysis would also be based on values. So with social media now so obvious that there are people seeing things differently because they are rooted in different values and inequality into the mix, then can think tanks or academics in general engage more with issues of value that we in some way have actually been a little bit uncomfortable dealing with, and then make more obvious the values that are underpinning the analysis and whose value counts anyway, and trying to engage with it. So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. And this will have to be the last question.
Thank you very much. My name's Ewan Murchison. I work in the UK Ministry of Defence in the Foresight world. Now, for me, it's really a question about foresight and data. For me, the only certainty about the future is its inherent uncertainty, a bit of a cliche, I know. And then when people are making decisions, they reach back for data. And the data and evidence often comes from the past, and therefore we're in danger of reinforcing old mental models. So how do we genuinely get our decision makers to think in a transformational way about the future and become more comfortable with uncertainty, but using data to do that?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Three very important questions. We have about 5 minutes to answer them. We'll start in reverse order from Anthony. Don't feel obliged to answer all. Answer the one you feel most passionate about.
Yeah, very tough questions, actually. Very good questions, and I think that's probably part of what we're looking for in a space like this, to make us ponder and think. It's very difficult, actually, to compete with certain styles and tactics. For example, when you are marshalling arguments, as you said, Heather, there are probably we live in an environment now where people are primed for things that are fast, clear, simple, direct, and they're actually very scientifically tested. So that phrase, take back control, was focus grouped to death using quite a lot of money and resource in order to identify what it was that people had, what resonated most with them. And I agree with Carlos in what he said in the previous discussion about the fact that many of our institutions are not inherently set up in order to operate in that way. So a couple of things there. I would say pictures tell stories. So when you're sitting on wonderful data, you have an obligation to produce great data visualization. I'll do a little plug for an initiative that we took at the OECD in 2011 called the Better Life Index. Take a look at it. If you Google Better Life Index, you'll get it, which is a good sign. It means it's popular and it's got to the top of the search engines. But it's designed to say we're not going to confront you with a 500-page book with lots of annexes that if you don't have a PhD you're going to find very intimidating. We're going to produce something for you that normal people can actually access, and it can speak to them and resonate with them. So I think there's an effort and a job to do on that level. The second level, I would say, is a concept that we would have to ponder, and that is, in the 1960s, consumer protection didn't exist. It was created by President Kennedy as of 1962. Do we need voter protection in today's day and age in order to be able to produce frameworks. Just as we felt that consumers needed protection at a certain time, if we value democracy as much as we do, wouldn't we need to think in terms of voter protection, perhaps in order to combat some of the elements that really there is no combating, because it may be the freedom to lie, not the freedom of speech.
Thank you so much. Kristel?
Yeah, I'll take your question. I'm passionate about that one, but I'll take that one. So, I mean, it's in general, it's something we've seen in everywhere, right? It's not just in governments. It just, at some point, it's a mental map change that people need to do, right? We go back to data because that's kind of what makes us comfortable. We can go with the known, you know. We kind of do these projections and these linear projections, the trends, as you said, because it gives us some sense of certainty, and we all love that. It makes decision making so much easier, right? So we have to move actually decision makers to a space where they're comfortable with not having that data, right? To be able to still make decisions despite having that handhold of the data. And there's two very simple ways I think you can do that, because you still want to stay with people's preferences for data. One very easy way to do that is take the data, take the forecasts, look at what assumptions and hypotheses are behind, because those data are not real, they're in the future, but there's hypotheses behind it, there's the modelings that you do and, you know, the forecasts, and look at it, look which hypothesis might be wrong and have a conversation about that. And a second way I find using future data quite interesting in decision making is by comparing and contrasting people's different forecasts, data sets about the future, because it's just enormous. If you do a bit of research on anything in the future, and you take people's modeling, you know, like price of oil in 15 years kind of thing, or GDP in 5 years growth, it's amazing the difference of forecasts you get. And that's when you can start working with people with data. Why do these people say this and these people say that? What are the assumptions? What is the difference? So have that conversation. It's not just about the data, it's having that conversation, but it's very concrete ways to stay with people's comfort zone of data while opening up to more reflection.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. Jakub, the question about values. I mean, you have values in the name of your think tank, so I suppose we know that values are important to you. But I want to ask you as well about the way in which having a stronger value proposition will change the world of think tanks, some of which today pride to be value neutral. I think it is something that the times are asking for. But how will this change the world of think tanks?
Well, we might use the bad examples of the bipartisan, let's say, huge polarity in Washington, D.C., partly in London as well. So if I tell you I believe think tanks need to have a strong opinion on their policy positions and advocate for it, you would tell me, but look at D.C., look at London. It doesn't really work, because then you'll have parties clinched and nothing will basically change. But I mean, we are at least to some extent missing this in Brussels, in Berlin, and in other capitals in Europe. Because at least on issues I deal with, let's say internal security matters like foreign influence activities, the voices are missing. It's easier to be researching the issue, which is important, but then have the conclusions you will stand up for on Russia-China issues. And just briefly to also respond to another question from the UK, basically what we have done over the last 2 years is that we have studied Central and Eastern European countries in a way how Russia tries to perform state capture efforts, how to actually get into that system and do elite capture. And asking about the foresight, one of the things which could be modeled, and we have it already public as well, is the step-by-step approach. If you study countries, let's say in Eastern Partnership region, so it's not so sensitive for us to discuss it, how they go step by step, you could actually project it. But, and you could see what will be the next step coming up. So there is no surprise that there will be an energy project coming from Russia for a specific European country right after that, because it's a great state capture effort as well. And just very briefly for responding how to use data to persuade political leadership. Well, my personal experience, and I believe yours would be as well, the only thing any politicians really care is re-election. And that's fine, that's how the system works. So, for example, what we have been focusing on is to basically show individual political leaders in various European establishments, this is something what touches you. And to some extent, what touches you as foreign policy establishment as experts. And the example I would give you is that we have done just very simple polling in my country, Czech Republic, which shows that approximately 1/3 of the Czech population believes that Ukraine is run by a fascist government, which first is not true. But why is important? Because if you are a political leader, a foreign minister of that country, you can't publicly advocate for supporting Ukraine because around 1/3 of your electorate thinks they are fascist. You can't send them weapons because of this. So it limits your policy options and at the end limits your national security options as well. So I mean, similar data we need, but it's actually quite sensitive. So many European governments and I mean institutions are not willing to go for it. So I mean, if I can have just one wish for the end of this, we can have Eurobarometer asking in each of the EU member states, what are the top 10 Russian government's lies on MH17, on Skripal, on Ukraine, on internal European affairs. And we can actually see, if we do this annually, what kind of a big problem we have in each of the European countries. We don't have that, because there's a political reason why we don't have it. It's too sensitive because it would show such a big problem we have in various European countries. This is what we need first, and second, what we need is real transparency of lobbying efforts in most of European capitals. At least on Russia-China, where I work, it's amazing how many European ministries are willing to take, for example, Gazprom data on energy security and consider them relevant first. Or we could say Huawei data on cybersecurity. I mean, and national security establishments are like, are we crazy? So we need transparency to show who is actually paying the lobbying efforts from the abroad. And just to have it transparent, I'm not saying banning it, just make it transparent. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Antonella, we are running out of time, so I want to ask you the Larry King question that I wanted to ask everyone. Namely, where will the world of expertise and think tanks and evidence be in 5 years' time? Maybe relating also to the question that Heather asked at the beginning, how the fractured demand for knowledge will translate into what think tanks do, what the world of expertise does in the future. So very briefly.
In general, I think that it will be definitely with more established pools of data and established pools of knowledge which are neutral. One will work with more of this, with more neutral standards, standards data sets, and I think that's going to be more analytics, definitely more analytics. I mean, we didn't discuss that, but more analytics, more AI-based analysis which will be done. That will be sort of the hard side, but definitely significant more effort on the soft side on how to deliver the points that we made, how to deliver. I mean, much, much more effort in terms of how to make sure that we really get to an impact.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have to leave it there. But I have to say that this panel has been reassuring for me personally. And it's surely because we've had 4 excellent speakers contributing. But what they have shown is how much renewal and how much reflection is taking place in the world of expertise, to put it more broadly. So that is our best hope. I think we need to reach out much more. Anthony spoke about that. And we need to constantly ask ourselves the question, how to face the challenges better. So thank you very much to all our panelists, and we will move on with the next one right away. So coffee will be well deserved when it comes, but we will now continue with another short discussion, another horizon scanning exercise about what goes on between our societies. If I could have your attention, what goes on between our societies and what goes on within our societies. So we heard earlier this morning that we live in the best and the worst possible times. if I could have your attention, we have 45 minutes now, and then we will have a very well-deserved coffee break. So if we could still focus on these essential issues. So to discuss these matters with me, I would like to invite Tarek Osman, the author and broadcaster, Daniel Schwammenthal, director of the AJC Transatlantic Institute, and Zuzanna Radzik, theologian and executive board member of the Forum for Dialogue in Poland. So warm welcome. Yeah, you're over there. And you have one there, right? Yeah. So Tarek, if I could start with you by asking you the question about what fuels fragmentation in our societies today. I mean, is it the transitions that they are undergoing, each one of us, and each in a different fashion, or is it something broader, something reflecting the cultural zeitgeist in which we find ourselves?
I have no idea. So I'll just think aloud. There was the professor in the morning, Professor Dresner? I think he said something fantastic, which is an American coastal professor will not lecture the Europeans on their own societies. So imagine an Arab coming from the southern Mediterranean lecturing you on what's happening in European societies. So let me start with what's happening in the Arab world to answer your question on fragmentation, and then give you my food for thought on what's happening in Europe. In my neck of the woods, it's very simple. In the last 30, 40 decades, we have a doubling of the population from roughly 170, 180 million people to around 330, 340 million people. The vast majority of them are less than 25 years old. So you have a generational issue. Two, you do have major economic challenges, and I'm being very polite, which means that most of those young people will not find any stable jobs, let alone jobs that will make them marry and have a flat and blah, blah, blah. And they blame their parents, rightfully so, in my opinion. This is not a joke. I think there is a generational failure, actually. It's something I wrote about in the Arab world, but that's a different story. But that creates tensions. I think one of the stories behind the Arab uprisings, I think it's now funny to say Arab Spring, right? But let's say the Arab uprisings of the past 7 or 8 years is that generational tension, if you'd like. And I think part of the answer was also from state elites was related to the need to put down the young, if you'd like. So that's another reason behind the fragmentation in the Arab world. And I think the role of religion, which is something is crucial in the Arab world, is a major issue. By religion, by the way, it's not only Islam. I also mean the role of religion as in the role of Christianity in the Arab world as well. I think that's a hugely contested issue, and it remains so. I can go on, but I think these are our key points about fragmentations in the Arab world. Now, the very rude Arab who will lecture the Arabs on what's happening in Europe, I think also Europe is going through, as an observer of Europe and really a lover of Europe, I think you are going through a point that I think is extremely interesting. As an observer, I think many people in Europe have rightfully said that the West has been more or less on some sort of decline relative to the others. The others is not us, the others is in Asia, not the Arab world. But that has been a clear sign, a clear trend, probably for the past, 10 years at least. But I think only in the last 5, 6 years with the hard-hitting economic consequences of the 2008 crisis, that now that fact is clear in front of many young Europeans who are also seeing, oops, my future is most likely going to be far from the rosy picture that a 25-year-old European national would have expected 10 years ago. And I think, guess what? It's probably correct. So I think you are having this economic issue, realization of a trend that was clear 10 years ago, but now very obvious. I think I'll be the politically incorrect one to say it. I think there is certainly a clear issues on immigration trends in Europe, not only because of the Syrian crisis. I think that has been anybody who spent any time researching something in the UK or France or the Netherlands, Belgium, I don't know, but maybe the same. I have done lots of work on political Islam in these countries. Anybody who spent any time seen that there has been a major issue lurking under the surface for some time. So I think that's coming to the surface. And finally, I personally think, though this is probably the rudest thing I'll say, and I'm looking at Anne for forgiveness before saying it, I think there has been lots of lovely talk in Europe, but as an Arab who very much Europe has been engaged in my part of the world for so many decades, positively and negatively, I think strategically Europe has been missing for a long time on the international scene. Lots of lovely talk, but really missing. Many people in the Arab world will say, thank God. I actually would not say that, but I think my point is the fact that such a rich continent with wonderful sense of its own wonder and glamour, rightfully so, looks itself in the mirror and sees the US and what's happening, and sees China and what's happening, and sees India and what's happening, and probably looks itself in the mirror and sees that, what am I really doing apart from really protecting myself? I actually, as somebody who loves Europe, I think it's probably one of the lurking, somebody was talking about emotions, lurking emotions that are causing lots of fragmentations, because I think the answers are very different. I also have I'll stop here because I'm going to say something extremely rude, so let me stop here.
No, but this is exactly the place to say things openly. So I will want to pursue this a little bit further. Namely, you are saying Europe is absent, but in what role would you like Europe to be present? I'm sure we can give another lecture on this, but we would like to understand better what type of presence this should be.
Again, I'll speak as somebody who comes from the Arab world. The cultural renaissance in the Arab world started in the early 19th century, primarily because of European cultural intervention. I'm not talking about the colonial intervention, cultural intervention. All the interesting debates on the role of religion in the Arab world were stirred by Arabs who were at massive interaction with Europe, not because they really loved Europe, but because Europe was the center of the universe at the time, whether it's Paris, Vienna, Roma, London, geopolitically, of course, and I'm not talking about the 19th century, even up to probably the 1970s, the grand men of Europe were extremely active in putting forward real ideas and following them with real diplomacy and following them with real ability to convene serious conferences. I'm not going to draw examples of some conferences that took place in Europe in 2018 about the Arab world. Europe was, long story short, Europe was a driving force in culture. Europe was a driving force in very serious socio-political debates in different parts of the world. What was happening in Europe was more or less where the antenna of many people in the world were going to, and I think European diplomacy was very active and very serious with the gravitas of grand, I don't want to say men because there were women as well, but grand persons with credibility. I think in the last 30, 35 years, I would argue probably from the late 70s, early 80s, there have been many trends. I'm not going to go into it, and you know about it much better than I do. But as an observer, I think, though there are fantastic cultural productions in Europe, but their impact is by far less than other parts. There's, of course, fantastic economic innovation that does take place in small spots in this continent and in the UK, but their impact on the major decisive industries that affect our lives now is minute. When it comes to politics and geopolitics, at least in the Arab world, I would put my hand on heart and say Europe has been majorly absent. In the room, yes, but majorly absent in terms of really affecting any of the key dossiers. And I'm not talking about Syria or Libya. I'm not talking about a crisis that emerges. I'm talking about the major simmering trends in the Arab world in the last 30 years.
Okay, thank you so much. Food for thought for us. Daniel, there has been a rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, in the world. more broadly, you wrote in the piece for us that anti-Semitism is a threat to the very fabric of our civilization, and now would subscribe wholeheartedly to that assessment. But if you could tell us what you think is happening that leads to this resurgence of anti-Semitism at this point in time.
There are, if we really want to focus on anti-Semitism, three major sources. There is, of course, the so-called old-fashioned right-wing anti-Semitism that we are mostly familiar with and which we all recognize. But to tell you honestly, this is not what I'm mostly concerned about. And the reason is that particularly when we talk about Western Europe, this is not where the major threat comes from, certainly not in terms of violence. And this is also where at least the Jewish communities can be assured of real solidarity from the rest of society. It gets more tricky when anti-Semitism comes from the Muslim community. And as a matter of fact, over the last 6 years, 15 Jews have been murdered in anti-Semitic attacks, all by radical Muslims. And here it is much more difficult to talk about it for a variety of reasons: political correctness, a understandable sensitivity not to try to stigmatize an entire community and not to fuel anti-Muslim sentiments separately, but nevertheless we need to confront the reality that unfortunately, particularly Arab but Muslim societies in general, arrive with anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism has been nurtured really over decades, and that many of immigrants and also second, third generations carry with them that kind of cultural baggage, and that we need to confront. And the other part of the anti-Semitic problem that really ails, particularly when we focus on West European Jewish communities, is anti-Semitism from the left, which comes disguised as anti-Zionism, as a sort of a supposedly legitimate political position. But we're not talking about criticism of the State of Israel, which of course everybody, particularly Israelis, do. But we're talking about demonizing Israel, rejecting its right to exist, comparing it with Nazis, and one doesn't have to be a psychiatrist why Europeans like to compare the Jewish state to Nazis. And also what happens a lot to hold Jews or individual Israeli citizens, civilians, responsible for Israel, something that doesn't happen in any other conflict around the world. And which really becomes again a problem also for Jews living here in Europe that are often confronted with this, bullied, etc. And we just have to take a hard look at the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, that has been taken over by somebody who seems to be equally comfortable with hardcore anti-Zionist as he is comfortable with Holocaust deniers, and radical Islamists. And why I believe this is so important is not just obviously, any form of racism, xenophobia, and so forth is a violation of our values and so forth, but anti-Semitism has a peculiar specificity. It often comes along with a sort of conspiracy theory. Your run-of-the-mill racist will hate a certain group, be it Muslims, be it Sinti Roma, whatever, and consider these individuals from this group inferior. The same is true for anti-Semites, but at the same time, while, typical the Untermensch, Jews are considered to be inferior, at the same time they are considered to somehow secretly control the world. So they are Unter- and Übermenschen at the same time. And so if you have a mindset that really an entire worldview, a warped, confused worldview that informs your whole thinking and basically makes you unfit for modern society and certainly for our Western civilization. And if that really takes root, we will no longer be functioning societies. And as a matter of fact, I would argue that these kind of conspiracy theories and deep-rooted anti-Semitism that has really been fed in the Arab world is part of the problem in the Arab world if you no longer look at yourself, critically examine your own societies. If you have an easy scapegoat and blame every personal and national misfortune on some conspiracy, then it's difficult to make progress.
And what do you make of the responses to that, especially recent rise in anti-Semitism? Because I suppose there is no doubt about the rejection of anti-Semitism by the mainstream, that for sure. But dealing with the more conspiratorial mindset is extremely challenging, and I understand the reasons why it concentrates in this anti-Semitic field. You describe the reasons. But, I mean, what are the tools that you can think of for making sizable progress along the way?
First of all, as I said, one of the problems is that two major sources of anti-Semitism are very difficult to discuss for various reasons, and we just need to overcome this. And I mean, the first of all is to identify and clearly articulate the problem before we can even begin to tackle it. And here, I think it is extremely important, first of all, to really also for individual Jewish communities in Europe, to feel the solidarity of the majority community, that one is not alone, that it is, these sentiments are equally rejected, whether they come from neo-Nazis with shaved head and black boots, as well as from within certain elements of the immigrant community or the far left. We just need to all stand up, and we need political leadership, opinion makers, policy makers, to always take a clear stand and make sure what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in polite company. That is, for me, a first step, and I want to, at this stage, sort of applaud the Austrian presidency, which is in the process of pushing through the European Council, and it's not easy, a declaration against anti-Semitism, which would also include a definition of anti-Semitism that would include these kind of new forms of anti-Semitism as I described earlier. But it's not easy, and it shows the difficulties we still have to overcome. And second, apart from the political confrontation, obviously when we're dealing with anti-Semitism that has a different quality within some elements of the Muslim community, this is a question of our overall integration policy that just needs to be radically different, not just in order to counter anti-Semitism, but obviously integration has, to a large extent, failed. Just look at the parallel societies that we have allowed to establish. To give you one policy advice that I could easily submit, I'm not sure it will be easily accepted. If you look at these schools in these problem zones, in these parallel societies, and you have schools with 90–100% of the kids coming from immigrant background or themselves recent immigrants, how are they supposed to integrate into the society if the classroom where they spend their formative years doesn't reflect the society but reflects the parallel society? So we need to take these kids out of these schools where they will not integrate, where we know they will fail no matter how much money we will put into these schools, and we need to distribute them among the general school system, which also would make the burden sharing of integration much fairer within the majority society, because at the moment, we are confronted with a situation where particularly sort of the lower class in Europe, in the poorer neighborhoods, who may not have voted for immigration in the first place for other reasons, nevertheless have to sort of take on the lion's share of trying to integrate people from a different background. And people who have made these decisions are to a large extent insulated from some of the negative consequences of it. And I think it would be much fairer to do it otherwise. And it may also, I think, be a contribution to take the fuel out of the populist parties that are to a large extent driven by anti-immigrant sentiments and by that feeling that there is not a fair burden sharing and that they've been imposed a policy that they don't have voted for.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Now, Zuzanna, you wrote for us that respecting the fact that we are diverse continues to be the most obvious solution, but at the same time, it is as unreachable as it has ever been. I mean, so how do we arrive at an acceptance of diversity in our societies?
Well, first of all, I admit that it sounds also a little bit cliché to bring such a solution, an obvious one. But yes, I'm coming from the country that, differently than the rest of Europe, is still not experiencing such a diversity every day. So if you look from the perspective of Poland, which is ever since post-war, very mono-ethnic, predominantly Catholic country, if you think what could be a solution, it's that you should train somehow in accepting or preparing for diversity and polyphonic voices. Because that's not, I mean, polyphonic voices you experience, of course, but broader diversity is not exactly the case. And I guess there are a couple of things that, you know, people say that when something inches, you scratch the skull. So my non-profit works in the schools. And we work there talking about pre-war Jewish history, which sounds pretty distant. And yet it's still an issue in Poland to have it commemorated, to have it embraced into the general history of small communities and bigger community. Sadly, almost 80 years after the destruction of Polish Jewry, we still haven't done it in a way that it should be. So that's what we do, but at the same time, the offshoot and the side effect of it is that it starts a conversation about diversity and its challenges that it brings into the classroom, which definitely we should be doing. And I think the other issue that some of the European countries are already tackling and others are not necessarily is teaching empathy and bringing difficult issues into the classroom, which we've seen it very much in 2015 in the fall after refugee crisis, and suddenly we enter schools as every year in the fall to talk about Jewish history, but at the end, you know, the kids want to talk about what happened in the summer. And no one yet talked with them about it because no one was prepared. And I understand that the teachers are overwhelmed, and what they do, they avoid hard topics. They're not prepared to really, they have 45 minutes, I don't know how it's in your countries, but they have 45 minutes, and they often say, I see that there is a difficult topic emerging in the classroom, and there I have a challenge of, do I stop and make a space for it? Which would be very meaningful in terms of, you know, values, being a citizen and all that, or I run with my, I don't know, history class, literature class, because I am expected to cover a lot of material during the year. What do we value as a communities when we you know, form our future citizens? This difficult conversation and training it in the safe environment, or avoiding it and learning how to bypass and avoid. And that's one of the things that we've seen more and more in the classroom. We, you know, as I said, we talk about particular issues, but one of the things that are surprising students is not only that they get to do their own project, that should be obvious, but that whatever it's said in the classroom, we stop and say, okay, so wait a minute. Why would you say that? What are the reasons? You just don't throw it into the classroom and leave it like that, or to just blow it. So that's one of the ways, I guess, to prepare us, or, you know, but that's a very Polish perspective, I have to admit, that it's sort of like, you know, training before you even get to be in the diverse environment. Although there are other, you know, diversities that you experience, and opinions are one of them, and we struggle with that recently a lot due to the polarization, you know, in the social media, that people lose the ability to talk about those issues in reality and also online. So the skills of, you know, the name of our organization is Forum for Dialogue, but we deal with Polish-Jewish, Christian-Jewish dialogue only. But this dialoguing and having meaningful conversation, empathetic and making space for others, that probably should be a topic in schools as important as literature, economics, math, and others.
Thank you so much. I will want to bring members of the audience for your comments and questions. So please signal that to me. But before I do that, and having heard what Zuzanna just said, I wanted to ask Tarek about how you feel about our understanding of each other, because what you described with respect to the realities in the Arab world is, yes, it's followed closely by X number of experts. There is a much more shallow knowledge of what's going on among the public. So how do you find our mutual understanding at this point in time?
Well, I think 2 or 3 quick macro points. The first is, at the time of economic difficulties in so many places in the world, the vast majority of people are really insular. It's about me and my community, and as opposed to the big issues, let alone the big issues on the other side of the sea. So I think we are in economically difficult times, and therefore people's priorities in general are on the near rather than on the far. 2, I am on social media, as most people are, but I am not a huge fan, to be very honest, because to a very large extent, to my mind, it, especially for young men and women who did not really grow up in a world before all of that, I think there is, what's the word in English? There is not just fragmentation, your consumption of info and of insight is become so tiny, and therefore the whole idea of contextualization is out of the picture for so many people, especially if your span of consuming news is basically 5 minutes a day. I think also the rise of platforms, entertainment platforms that give you what you want based on algorithms, and which at the time of your choice is great and wonderful for all of us, but it also kills I don't know in Europe, but in the Arab world there was always the 8 p.m. news. The very boring 8 p.m. news, in which starts with the king did and the president met and nobody cared, but it set the narrative. It set the narrative. The agenda was for everybody, and therefore you can talk about these things and make the jokes on the president and the king and blah, blah, blah. But at this stage, I think I'm not sure how many people in the room go back home and set to watch the 8 p.m. news, probably as I do. I'll put on Netflix or YouTube, so it's my entertainment, it's my agenda. So what I'm trying to say is that also not only contextualization is being diluted, but also that the social agenda that everybody can have as what's happening, let's talk about it, is increasingly not there. So it's these 2 general macro points. But the final point, which is really the answer to your question, is I think both sides, the people who care, who are a minority probably on both sides, care about the other community, to a very large extent have a sense of fear. In the Arab world, we are going through an extremely low point. We've been going through a low point for 350 years, but a very low point for the past 10 years. And I think people who care about what's beyond their environment have a sense of fear. The idea of where the Arab world is going is very sobering for lots of people, like myself. That people whose identity is Arab have also many question marks about what's happening. So what I'm trying to say is the people who care about global affairs, we have certain anxiety, and of course there's always the element of, immediately the element of blaming the other. To be honest, we don't blame Europe much, related to my first point, because Europe is not necessarily a major player at this stage, sadly, sorry to say it. So most of the blame goes to the other side of the Atlantic, or to neighbors. But not necessarily to Europe. But in general, for the players from Europe, yes, there is an element of a bit of blame. But I think there's also in my observation at least, there is a bit, if not a lot, of fear in Europe from us. Not fear as in, oh my God, those people will overtake us or something. No, but it's the fear of that the problems of the Arab world has become so much that they may spill over to us, as in to Europe, and at a time of not necessarily great political leadership in general, at a time of economic difficulty, at a time of young people fearing for their own future, at a time of huge concerns on immigration, blah, 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 blah. the sense is we need to detach, we in this case Europe, need to detach ourselves completely from that part of the world because we do not want their problems to us. And that's now, I think, almost a normative narrative in Europe. Now, I don't blame Europe. Europe need not to attend to others' problems, but I think it's by far more complex issue than this super simplistic and, in my opinion, wrong diagnosis. So all of that, I think, does not lead to a great understanding on both sides.
Well, part of the reason why Europe is absent, as you have seen, is deliberate. Namely, Europe had been engaged before in many ways. It now would prefer to build the relationship on the idea of partnership, namely on the pursuit of mutual interests rather than on the pursuit of our vision as opposed to your vision. So the question is, I mean, is there a coherent vision coming from the Arab world for this type of arrangement to work? Because partnership can only work when the two sides have a pretty clear idea of what they want to achieve. Now, frankly, I mean, you said we are absent, but if I can react to that, the reaction would be that we're not really hearing a loud and clear voice from the Arab world about what type of engagement you would expect.
I disagree. You are hearing a very, very loud and clear voice from certain parts of the Arab world, primarily from the Gulf. And primarily from extremely active players in the Gulf who are incredibly close partners of very, very influential capitals in Europe. They are by far among the largest buyers of arms. They are by far among the largest payers to political communication agencies, especially in this city. They are by far among the most important contributors to campaign financing, directly or indirectly, in Europe. They are by far with great access to, not necessarily European, but American media, but American media has great presence here. The question, I think, that many in Europe needs to think about, and I'm not lecturing anybody, I mean, but the food for thought is, you said the word partnership, which is a word I'm not a big fan of, to be honest, because when you partner with someone, you always have to have some sort of a common vision on where you're going together, or at least some sort of a mutual, somebody was talking about values today, at least you have some sort of similar values, some similar modus operandi, or at least agreement on what modus operandi we will resort to, what we will not resort to. And I think Europe has lots of question marks, or at least should have lots of questions about whether it shares many of these regarding the loud and clear voices that come from the most decisive parts of the Arab world. Now, I come from Egypt. So Egypt is North Africa, the core of the Arab world, as we used to say. Traditionally, the Arabs for you, traditionally in the last, I'm reading a book today on Salah ad-Din, Saladin. So our way together go way, way back. To you, the Arabs is usually us, as in North Africans and the Eastern Mediterraneans. That's for you, even from the very early days of Islam coming out of Arabia. It didn't matter to Europe until it reached the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa. So for you, when we say the Gulf, it's more or less this vague player out there. But in order not to speak forever, there is lots of interaction with the Arab world. The question, and you interact with it on a partnership. I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but the question is, there are many questions on your side regarding these partnerships.
Great, I think we're getting close to the heart of the issue, and I've seen at least one hand going up on that side of the room, and maybe on this side of the room too. Yeah, please.
Thanks very much. Very interesting discussions, very different. You're having very different discussions at the moment. And I wanted to see if I could tie Zuzanna and Tarek's together a little bit. Zuzanna was talking very much about diversity and inclusion and how do you foster that kind of conversation. And I want to poke you to get into that a little bit more and give you a little bit more space to talk about it. But also, Tarek, for you, because I thought you laid out some very important issues at the very beginning of your discussion. And I wanted to see what's your perspective on some of the work that Marwan Mouashar has been trying to advance. And that more introspective discussion in terms of the Second Arab Awakening and the role that pluralism may or may not play in the future of the Middle East. If this session is kind of a futures-looking session, and if the title is what it is meant to be, I'm interested in what's that future conversation look about diversity and inclusion in the Middle East context, recognizing that the Gulf is a very different conversation from North Africa, and it's very different from Southern Africa as well. But just on the North Africa and Gulf part, what is your view on what Muasher is trying to advance?
Thank you so much. Any other comments or questions here? No? So Zuzanna, about inclusion and about, I think being also practical about it, because I think we've identified the problem quite right. You could call it planktonization of knowledge as well. Namely, we do have people with sort of pockets of wisdom, but they often don't get the complete picture. We are experiencing that in this house too, when we have a visitors center. People come from all over Europe. They know bits and pieces about the European Union, but they know less and less about how to put these bits and pieces together. I think that's the experience. So that is also a reflection of how sort of knowledge is getting planktonized. But how can we go about it in a more systematic fashion?
So thank you for poking me into more. So first of all, well, we mentioned today also privatization, and Tarek talked about it, the Netflix syndrome of you just get what you want and you don't have one narrative, but we also are still suffering from one narratives very much. And if I think about struggle that goes on, mainly in the Central Europe, I would say, probably. I don't know that much about this in the West. You probably have different issues, but we are this year, 100 years after end of the First World War. Next year we'll have 80 years of the beginning of the Second World War. We are still living through memories of those, especially the second one. As for Poland, probably Hungary, this kind of identity game of confronting yourself with how was it, who were we, in the Polish context it's more, were we the victims or also persecutors, how do we deal with it, what about the Holocaust happened here, were we participating to what extent. It's 80 years and we still are struggling with it, and one of the problems is that we did have one narrative. We did have one narrative during communism about it, more or less, and censorship about much of those topics. And then in the New Poland, we also tried. We struggled about how we should tell those stories, but we still didn't get into details. So I really very much like the award winner who mentioned folk stories and decolonization of storytelling. And I would love to learn. If you are still here, I would love to learn more. But it's something that we experience when you go out and ask people how do they remember things from the recent history and the more distant history, and suddenly you realize that it's not all the same. That the memory of a Polish peasant from the World War II about partisans, it's so different than we were taught at school. It's not about heroes. It's about people who robbed them from food, and they hated them. And suddenly it collapses, this one national narrative collapses, and I think for good, because it teaches you complexities of history and the lessons that you can draw from it. So that's one of the tools of making things more complicated and narratives more complicated. The second example I wanted to give you is linked to this 100 years of end of the First World War. Exactly today, 28th of November, we have 100 years of women right to vote in Poland. So I actually did wear a pink dress to celebrate that, to make it more bold that we are present in the public. So that's my private way of celebrating. But in fact, in this whole 100 years celebration, it's 100 years of Polish independence and 100 years of women's votes. And you have the special stamps issued. And guess who is there? Still only men. It's like... there is this, so again, there is this really deep need of making it more diverse, also in the gender-wise, class-wise I mean, there are all the like other diversities present that we are not speaking, not only ethnic or religious, but very much that is an issue that we should embrace in our own communities.
Yeah, thank you so much. Before I turn to Tarek, maybe Daniel would like to come in on this issue of the narrative, I would say in particular, because in fighting anti-Semitism, I think you've been pretty focused on a specific narrative, which is the good thing. But how do you sort of respond to the other challenges that you are facing with in this fashion? Also by understanding the way people look at things, the other people's narratives.
If you talk about narratives in that context of anti-Semitism, I assume you mean particularly the sort of new forms of anti-Semitism that comes disguised as perhaps anti-Zionism, as a sort of a legitimate political position. And in here, I think it's, the definition that, as I mentioned, that the so-called International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance has put forward in order to define what really is, how can we grasp this form of anti-Semitism? Because one element of anti-Semitism is also, it's often been likened to a virus. It adapts to the changes in society. It originally, maybe in an early Christian society, it came up as, Jews as a Christ killer. As European societies become less religious, this didn't work anymore necessarily as a justification. So it became often, sometimes the most socioeconomic aspect. Jews, control capital, or Jews are all communists. And then in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, a pseudo-scientific Darwinian idea of various races. And so it is nothing new that there are new narratives, new justifications for why Jews are evil, why Jews control the world. And I think we need to be we just need to look at the fact that we are not talking about, as I said, criticism, but when you demonize somebody, be it a country, a group, that's simply unacceptable, that's racism. Nobody could plausibly say, I don't believe that Ireland has a right to exist, but I'm not anti-Irish. That's a narrative these people are trying to sell, and I'm surprised that it's quite that it seems to work so well, but it may work for other reasons. And maybe also on the other hand, also a little bit to what's going on in parts of the Muslim world and societies, because very often we have sort of accepted as natural that Arabs, Muslims somehow certainly hate Israel and maybe also don't like Jews because of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And take a step back. How can we simply accept that? I mean, nobody I know who is well-adjusted and well-educated turns on the television and sees a conflict 4,000 kilometers away and suddenly says, I need to kill or hurt one of the participants of this conflict. It is not the natural outcome of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that an Arab originally maybe from Morocco, 4,000 kilometers away, with all sorts of problems in his or her own country and lots of problems here, suddenly feels that they need to do something against a Jew in Belgium or in France. So we need to understand all of these are not narratives that make any sense. These are ideas and that are taught. Hatred is always taught. It doesn't come natural. It's not the outcome of some conflict. It is being taught, and we just need to confront it. That there is, no narrative, no justification, no explanation. Just as there is no justification, narrative, explanation for any other form of it. It's actually quite easy to break through the sort of fog.
Yeah, thank you so much. Two brief
sentences
words
to add to the anti-Semitism topic, since Daniel speaks more from the Brussels perspective, I guess, just to keep our part of Europe on the spectrum too. So we do deal with the differences there. There is a still pretty big conspiracy anti-Semitism, of course. But it's still, but it's at the same time together with the BDS and other issues are minor there. There is quite a strong support for Israel at the same time. So you can have it too at the same time, and also keep traditional as a serious issue. Traditional anti-Semitism that was mentioned. You said there used to be the previous narrative was about Christ killers. Well, we have 25% of Poles in the polls saying that they do believe in the Christ killer motive or blood libel. It's not, it's not no problem. And I'm saying that not only to, it's not to share it only here, but it's also to show that there is a certain that those theme lasts and they don't leave us. They have 2,000 years and they don't leave us. So we have to be very proactive about it and just don't assume that they will go with a lower religiosity, or there's so much in the culture that they pops up in different places in the weirdest way, and they come back. So we should be aware that those old narratives are still with us somewhere.
Thank you so much. We are almost ready to take coffee, but Tarek, I would like you to answer that question, the Middle East.
Okay, super fast, I hope. Marwan Marshal's argument rests, I think, on 3 points. One is that the state-citizen contract in the Arab world has fallen or is being broken. I think it has been broken for at least 30 years. I think his key corollary is more interesting, is that, and he's actually, a number of people have been writing about that in the post-high oil price world, which is almost a certainty upon us right now, then that broken state-citizen contract is no longer a feature of North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, but it's coming to the Gulf, where the modus operandi has always been buy off everybody else through immense cash investments into social services, blah, blah, blah. I agree. I have absolutely agreement with that. But I think, to my mind, and we can leave it at that because I can talk after that for 2 hours, is that there are so many soft aspects of the state-citizen relationship, especially in the Arab world, that has to do with, anyway, many other soft issues that have been decaying, and that the relationship between the state and the citizen in the Arab world, including in the Gulf, has had so many other factors that could not be bought by oil, and that even in the Gulf, the hard expressions of hard power of the state have always been there. It's not only a soft relationship based on, I'll put money, nobody will care. There has always been, I don't want to say oppression, but very strong tools of hard power deployed in the state, in the Gulf, as they were in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, and that even those are now starting to fail because of the usual suspect, technology, blah, blah, general demographics and others. So long story short, I agree on the macro point. The final thing, I know that you want me to take this out of me, hand Rahim, but the second point, which I think is important, is something that I think you said, or it was said at your panel. So what? He's saying that, all right, and then. And his and then, again, and so many people in the Arab world has been saying that, and maybe it's a bit related to the partnership, is a bottom-up narrative. So it's not about the top-down and a new constitution, and with all great respect to all of these things, but it is about the gender equality. It is about getting people who are in remote parts of Egypt, say, or in Morocco, or what have you, to get them economically empowered to start to say, hold on, I now have a small loan from the bank. I need to make sure that there will be no change in the regulation related to blah, blah, blah. So all of the things of the bottom-up socioeconomics, which, as a political economist, self-justification, but I think by default would lead to a bottom-up change in the political system. And I think that was Marwan Marshal's and others, several others, recipe, if you'd like, for getting out of this broken state-citizen relationship. I think I have done a huge disservice to Marwan Marshal's thinking and to lots of other people thinking, because it's much more complicated. But I guess that's the 1 minute answer to that question.
Thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there. We heard in the comment that perhaps we're having different conversations around this table. I was thinking about whether that's good or bad. And I don't know. I mean, it's normally you tend to have a single conversation, and we are used to it. But in today's circumstances, maybe having different conversations for the first week or two, and then having a single conversation is the right recipe. What I know for sure is that we need to break for coffee, and it will have to be a fairly quick coffee for 20 minutes, if we may, and then we will start a session from hindsight to foresight, which Anne will moderate. A big thank you to all the speakers.